Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again. Since November last year, 2022, Uber drivers were making strikes and Uber administration was trying to make negotiations. And there were a couple of meetings. And actually, last time we covered our conversation or our interview. Again, I do have a guest, Freddie, who's actually the Director of Public Relations in East Coast regions. Freddie, good to have you again.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me back.
Since we had the interview last week, I guess a couple of 2 weeks ago, I remember that we talked about that there were strikes, there were disputes between drivers and the Uber. But we are actually hearing, whether it's a rumor or not, I'm not sure. We're hearing that there is an agreement between Uber and the Minnesota Rideshare Drivers Association, known as MED. So is that true, or are we taking as a rumor?
No, it is not a rumor. It is true, and it is good news. I'm sure you remember that when I was here a few weeks ago, we were in active conversations. As you said, I've been communicating with leadership from MRDA, the Minnesota Rideshare Drivers Association, since November. They were very active in the press and with elected officials talking about some concerns they had driving on our platform, and we started those conversations, and I'm really excited that after months of back and forth, we've come to an agreement on ways that we can make things better.
So now you're actually confirming that there is an actual agreement between Minnesota Rideshare Drivers Association, known as MRDA, and Uber.
Yes, we have come to an agreement.
Great. What we know is you had an agreement with Minnesota Rideshare Drivers Association, which is actually good news. So is this agreement going to be in effect right now?
No. So we have an agreement. We've come to terms. We've decided on what we can do moving forward. But the agreement depends on state law being changed. So, we're going to work together to talk to legislators and try to make this a state law, in which case, hopefully, it will go into effect this summer or later this year.
The next question that I have is can you compare the difference between the current drivers' take-home earnings and what will charge if the agreement passes to the Capitol Hill?
Sure. So let me just zoom out a little bit first.
Great.
Our agreement covers a number of topics. Obviously, compensation is top of mind for drivers. We know that they, the first thing they're thinking about when they get in the car is how much money am I going to bring home for my family today? So that was a huge part of our conversation. But there were also some conversations about insurance and vehicle use and, worker classification and all of that stuff. To answer your compensation question, the agreement that we have in place right now, if it's passed at the Capitol, would just about double what drivers make right now. So drivers would take home $1.15 per mile driven.
Sure.
And 25 cents per minute driven. It took us a while to get there. It started, the drivers started much higher, we started much lower. I don't know that we certainly are walking away feeling happy about the deal, but it was a very tough negotiation.
So when do you think this deal is going to be finalized?
It's a good question. We are hoping that we can work with MRDA to meet with legislators at the Capitol, make them aware that we've come to this agreement, hopefully generate some support from our elected leaders and get something done this year so that drivers can see these changes, as soon as this summer or fall.
Most likely in summer. So before that, is there any compensation that they'll be getting or what? What is the deal?
Until we have this deal legally in place, the current compensation rates will remain the same.
Great.
Minara Homes waxay idin haysaa guryo aad u qurux badan dhismayaashoodu oo runtii idin cajab gelin doona. Guryahaasi waxay noqon doonaan ay idinka iibinayso shirkadaasi caanka ah ee Minara Homes. Guryo gaagaaban oo ah kuwa Soomaalida u taqaano villooyinka iyo guryaha kale ee apartmentska ah. Lacagaha habka aad u bixinaysid daawadow waxa weeye lacagta marka ugu horeysa aad dhigaysid amaba down paymentka loo yaqaano 30% ayaad bixinaysaa waxaana lacagtaasi ay socon doontaa muddo lagu qiyaaso 4 sanadood. Dhismayaasha guryaha ayaa waxa ay socon doonaan 2 sano inta dhismahaasi socdana waxaad bixinaysaa iyadana 40 boqolkiiba lacagtii guriga marka la isku daro 30kii hore ee aad dhigtay iyo 40 ka dambe 70 boqolkiiba waxay noqonaysaa marka aad bixisid in furaha gacanta laga saaro hamogaanin Kenya magaalada Nairobi guryaha ugu quruxda badan iyo meelaha ugu quruxda badan oo ay dhisto shirkadda Minara Homes ku soo dhawaada.
Is there any occupational insurance with your agreement with Marta?
Yeah, great question. So Uber covers a number of insurance policies for drivers on our platform currently, but what we heard pretty much right away from Murda and from other drivers that we met with was that they felt like the current coverage was not meeting all of their needs. So occupational accident insurance is a coverage that is specifically used in the case of independent contractors, right? There's worker compensation for employees, but drivers are independent contractors. We want to work with the state to allow this type of insurance in Minnesota. Currently, Minnesota is one of 10 states in the country that doesn't allow this coverage. So we want to negotiate based on the terms of our agreement to get the insurance coverage here.
Great. What we understand is like when there are disagreement, usually people they present their demands, and now you are telling me that Uber had to actually deal with Murda. So is that can we translate like most of their demands are met, or still they are not satisfied?
I mean, I think you'd have to ask Murda, but I feel, we've been really negotiating in good faith. I hope that, they feel the same way. I think we have met most of their demands. Of course, in a negotiation, there's always going to be something that they didn't get and something that we didn't get, but I really feel that we've met in the middle in a very good place.
Great. The other question that I do have is like, are there any other union that you are actually having any conversation, or is the main union is Murda, which is Minnesota Rideshare Drivers Association?
Sure. Right now, we have been in conversation with the Minnesota Rideshare Drivers Association. I know that there are other driver associations out there, and we would happily meet with them too. Murda, at this point, has been the ones that have, been leading on deal making.
Great. Freddie, you are the director of public relations in East Coast, which absolutely consists of a couple of states.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to deal with that kind of hard job. So what is your experience, and what are the things that you see Uber drivers and the Uber management will have a bright future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there are some things in certain places that are unique, right? Minneapolis is certainly unique compared to some other states I work in that the driver population is largely Somali, which has its own set of customs and, language barriers and all of that, versus when I work in Pennsylvania, for example, where the drivers are largely English speaking and more part-time than we might experience with some of the drivers here. But one thing that always comes up across the board, or a few things, compensation, a big thing is deactivations as well, which is helpful because we've been able to sort of develop a model for dealing with these issues. Here in Minnesota specifically, we have launched with the Minnesota Rideshare Drivers Association a deactivation review center. So drivers that have been deactivated from the platform for any number of reasons that don't understand why or think it was maybe a mistake and want to appeal that decision can get in touch with Murda, and Murda has a direct contact with us to file these complaints, and we will do a second review and let the driver know if anything can be changed.
Finally, what else is that you addressed and you let them know, Murda or any other driver?
Yeah, so I think there are 4 main pieces of this agreement. We've discussed 2, a deactivation review, process, compensation, increases in compensation.
2.
The other 2 are things that we heard directly from Murda. So we heard that they really care about being independent contractors. Some initial conversations happening at the State House had some information that would likely lead to reclassification of drivers as employees.
Sure.
So we wrote into this agreement that drivers are independent contractors, that they remain independent contractors. That has been, something that MRTA has addressed with us from day one. And something else we've heard is that drivers are frustrated because Minnesota requires that a car must be under 10 years old and also have fewer than 150,000 miles. That's part of the ordinance here. That's not an Uber requirement.
Sure.
So we are working with MRTA to address that as well.
Finally, what is your last say to them? Since finally you had reached agreement with Minnesota Rideshare Drivers Association. What's your word to them?
Yeah, I think from my earliest conversations here, I've heard a few times a phrase, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but conversation is problem solving, right? Something like that. And I think this agreement really demonstrates that. We came together, we sat at the table together, we broke bread together, and we talked for hours and hours. I think now we have something that people are going to be really happy with.
Thank you. That's the end of our conversation today. I had a pleasure meeting with and have an interview with the Director of Public Relations in Uber in East Coast, Freddie. And we talked about last time that Uber drivers had been complaining about a pay raise or whatever it is. And finally, Uber and MRTA, which absolutely called Minnesota Rideshare Drivers Association, has finally reached an agreement. Thank you, and thanks for having you again here.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.